It's October 23, 1942, at the German headquarters of Alamein, and the morning briefing makes no sense. General Stumme's chest tightens as his staff confirms it. British artillery is pounding their northern positions. 600 tanks, 1,000 guns, and an entire armored corps are attacking from positions that held only supply trucks yesterday. This couldn't be. For 6 weeks, German reconnaissance flights had captured the same ominous site in the south. Hundreds of tanks, mountains of supplies, an entire armored corps poised for attack. Now, as the north erupts in battle, Stumme is caught in a vice. Pull forces from the south to reinforce the fighting, or risk leaving it exposed if the Allies strike. Then the message comes from the southern sector. The British armor isn't moving. Can't move. They're not tanks at all. By the summer of 1942, the British were losing the Desert War. General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had smashed through Libya and was racing east across Egypt, heading straight for Cairo in the Suez Canal. British outposts fell in rapid succession. Nothing seemed to stop the advance. Now, only one place remained to stop them: Alamein. Though nothing more than a railway stop in the desert, the terrain made it crucial. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south stretched the Qattara Depression, a vast expanse of soft sand, impassable to tanks. Between them were just 30 miles of defensible ground that both sides desperately wanted. The First Battle of El Alamein erupted on July 1, 1942. For nearly 4 weeks, Rommel threw his forces against the British line, while the Commonwealth defenders, including Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian units, fought desperately across the minefields and open ground. Then, supply shortages and heavy resistance forced the Axis advance to stall. The Desert Fox stayed at the front, reinforcing his position and waiting for the chance to strike again. In August 1942, General Claude Auchinleck was removed from commanding the 8th Army, the main British-led force defending El Alamein. In his place came Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. Highly disciplined and methodical, and so confident it bordered on arrogance, the 54-year-old took over a worn-down and thinly stretched force. Montgomery spent the rest of the month reorganizing the infantry and bringing in reinforcements, supplies, vehicles, and equipment every single day. By late September, the British had a clear advantage in manpower, armor, and artillery. The general was sure that the main assault at El Alamein would take place in the north, where the terrain was firmer and the supply lines shorter. But despite now being in the best condition the 8th Army had seen since the start of the campaign, nothing about the terrain had changed. The Axis positions were mined and fortified. The front was watched 24/7, and Rommel's army remained as dangerous as ever. Surprise seemed out of the question, yet without it, the attack would certainly fail. Then Brigadier Dudley Clark, head of deception tactics for Middle East Command, had a eureka moment. If the British couldn't hide the buildup in the north, they would have to shift the enemy's attention to the south. He passed the concept to a junior deception officer named Charles Richardson, who would be responsible for fleshing out the idea. The operation was given a name: Bertram, and with the clock against the Commonwealth, a scheme began to take shape. Desert heat shimmered off the sand as Harold Alexander, the newly appointed Middle East commander and Montgomery's superior, stepped out of his staff car on August 8, 1942, for a visit to the camouflage unit at Helwan, just south of Cairo, Egypt. Before him was a collection of workshops and warehouses that looked more like a film studio lot than a military installation. Leading it all was Jeffrey Barkas, director of camouflage for the Middle East, who watched nervously as Alexander toured the facilities. The commander lingered the longest in the woodworking shop, where dummy tanks, canvas, and wood constructions were made. Barkas smiled as Alexander nodded his head. Before the war, Jeffrey Barkas was a man of the movies, a director and editor who worked on silent films and later directed his own features, such as The Third Gun in 1929 and Tell England in 1931. But his career hit a dead end, with his last notable credit being editing the 1937 film Roads of Africa. He took a job with Shellmex BP, a move that would change his fate. Working for Shell, he had his first approach to field camouflage. When war erupted, he was drafted into the Royal Engineers and thrown into a comprehensive camouflage course. His filmmaking skills, his eye for detail, and his understanding of large-scale deception and set design were suddenly not just useful, but vital. The desert became his new soundstage. As the director of camouflage for the Middle East, Barkas led a team of artists, sculptors, and designers in a desperate race against time. Their mission was to fool the enemy and misdirect their attention in any way possible. On September 16th, the telephone rang at Barkas's headquarters. Freddie de Guignon, Montgomery's chief of staff, wanted to see him and camouflage artist Tony Ayrton as soon as possible at 8th Army headquarters near Bourg el Arab. Once there, de Guignon ushered them into a secure briefing room and closed the door. He was not going to downplay the flatter. Alexander was impressed, and he wanted to put their talent to the ultimate test. Who laid out the scale of the upcoming Second Battle of El Alamein. In mid to late October, hundreds of tanks and guns would need to move north into position without being noticed. At the same time, the enemy had to be convinced that a full armored corps was gathering in the south. Everything, the vehicles, the supplies, even the timing, had to suggest that the southern force was real and that the northern one didn't exist. In other words, they had to hide a real army and build a fake one. Barkas felt his pulse quicken and tried not to open his mouth in shock. For months, his unit had been creating small-scale deceptions, hiding a gun here and disguising a vehicle there, proving that clever camouflage worked in the desert despite the lack of natural cover. But this was a whole other level. They needed to fool Rommel, who was perhaps the smartest commander in Africa. Before accepting the overwhelming task, Barkas and Ayrton left the headquarters and walked out to the nearby beach dunes, finding a spot among the sandhills where they sat down to think their way through the plan. Just then, Barkas remembered a key project he'd worked on with magician Jasper Maskelyne a year earlier. The man had been challenging to manage and too theatrical for military discipline, but the duo developed the first version of the Sun Shield, a canvas and wood cover designed to make a tank look like a harmless supply truck from the air. Back then, Maskelyne's prototype was so heavy it took a dozen men to lift, and it fell apart during its very first trial run. Still, Barkas knew the design had great potential for a much lighter version. The ideas began flowing between them as they spent a couple of hours sketching in the sand and their notebooks. By the time they returned to base, knowing they had the framework of something solid, the duo commandeered a typewriter and hammered out the proposal while the details were still fresh. When they presented it to de Guignon and Richardson later that afternoon, the plan was clear. First, they would build 2 full dummy armored brigades and position them in the south to suggest an attack from that direction. Second, they would move the real tanks and artillery north, disguising them to look like supply trucks. Intrigued, Richardson leaned forward and made a suggestion of his own. Recalling an earlier deception at Meshefa, a location south of the main battle lines, where the camouflage unit devised an entire dummy railhead, complete with fake tracks, stations, and supply dumps that convinced German aerial reconnaissance that the British were building up forces in that sector. Barkas was already ahead of him, and instead proposed constructing a fake water pipeline that extended southward into the desert, which would be built deliberately slowly, with construction appearing to progress at a crawling pace that suggested any attack in that direction was still weeks and weeks away. Within a fortnight, the plan made its way up the chain of command to Montgomery, who approved it with one characteristic demand: think bigger. Instead of creating dummy armor for 2 brigades, he wanted an entire armored corps, a scale so large that deception would be impossible to ignore. This meant over 600 fake vehicles. He even added another layer, Operation Canwell, a coordinated radio deception effort to flood the airwaves with false traffic, selling the illusion not just to enemy pilots, but also to enemy signals intelligence operators. Back at Helwan, Barkas stood in his workshop, reading the orders that had just come through. The former film director allowed himself a wry smile as he prepared to mobilize his unit to build the grandest illusion the Desert War had ever seen. On September 27th, Operation Bertram became a reality. Richardson took Barkas's concept and integrated it into the broader operational framework, synchronizing the deception with actual troop movements, supply schedules, and combat preparations. The fundamental challenge was at the northern Martello staging area, near El Yamayid railway station, where hundreds of tanks would mass before the assault. To hide them, Barkas and his men rolled out a new and improved version of the Sun Shield. These much lighter canopies were built in 2 hinged halves that folded along the sides of the tank. The design was simple and efficient. Only 2 men were needed to lift, fit, and remove the disguise in minutes. Multiple models were created to match the shapes of different tanks, including Crusaders, Ballantynes, Grants, and Shermans, creating a total of 722 sun shields, each numbered and pre-positioned. In the middle of the night, the tank crews were trained on how to use them, learning to transform their tanks into trucks and back again without lights, without noise, and without exposing the deception. According to historian Peter Forbes, these simple wooden canvas devices became, quote, the most successful and the most exhilaratingly mimetic of the deceptions practiced in the desert. The artillery presented its own unique challenge, as the heavy and distinctively shaped field guns and their limbers couldn't simply vanish into the desert. Instead, the camouflage unit repositioned the limber's long towing pole to overlap with the gun trail, then draped a specially designed canopy over the entire assembly. The result looked exactly like a British 3-ton truck, with the real wheels of both gun and limber visible beneath the canvas where a truck's wheels would naturally be. They called this technique cannibal. The artillery pieces were essentially swallowed whole by their disguises. In total, 360 cannibals were created and deployed across 2 main areas, with the rear concentration zone and the forward barrage position near Alamein station aptly named Cannibal 1 and Cannibal 2 respectively. Another disguise involved a distinctive Morris C8 quad tractors that towed the 25-pounder guns, whose unique silhouette instantly revealed the presence of artillery to any reconnaissance aircraft. The solution was simpler, but just as effective. Camouflage nets were stretched over pole frames to create the boxy outline of a standard supply truck, with the quad's real wheel still visible in the right position beneath the netting. While the Northern Force prepared its disguises, the real supply dumps needed to be hidden. Engineers near Alamein station discovered that petrol cans stacked along trench shadows disappeared from aerial view. 2,000 tons of fuel were concealed this way, over 100,000 4-gallon tins vanishing into stone-faced trenches, invisible to German reconnaissance. Food supplies in the north were disguised as trucks through creative stacking. Boxes were arranged to mimic vehicle shapes, large piles for the body, smaller ones for the cab and engine, then covered with camouflage netting. Sugar and cigarettes were buried deep inside, with command accepting the theft risk to maintain the deception. But concealing stationary equipment was only half the battle. When Montgomery's tanks moved from Martello to their attack positions, German aerial surveillance would interpret any missing vehicles as cause for alarm. To maintain the illusion, Barkas would need to replace each real tank with a dummy, fast. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Over 400 fake tanks, 100 artillery pieces, and nearly 2,000 decoy trucks. In addition to all of this, in the south, where they wanted German attention, engineers had to create an entirely different illusion. Just like Montgomery ordered, the unit had to build nearly 700 dummy supply stacks. These fake depots had to be minutely designed and placed to be everything an armored corps would need: ammunition, petrol, food stores, and equipment. From above, it would look like the British were prepping for a southern offensive. To achieve this monumental Operation Bertram deception in under 4 weeks, Jeffrey Barkas assembled an unusual team, recruiting even more designers, architects, and artists. Brian Robb exemplified this approach. Enlisting as a private, his artistic talents quickly caught Barkas's attention, and within weeks, he was promoted to staff lieutenant, working alongside Tory Ayrton, a senior staff overseeing the entire operation. The manufacturing challenge was monumental. For this, 3 pioneer companies were assigned to Barkas's command. The unit from East Africa handled the structural work, shaping palm hurdles and bed frames into tank hulls, turrets, and chassis. The Mauritian company managed the textile side, cutting and stitching massive sheets of hessian to cover the frames. And the Seychelles became the finishers, painting each dummy with realistic markings and weathering to make them convincing from the air. Managing this nearly 800-man workforce was no easy feat, as the 3 companies harbored mutual suspicions and rivalries that could have collapsed the entire scheme. Barkas solved this by spacing their camps as far apart as the site allowed, minimizing friction. Additionally, to maintain secrecy, he arranged for an exclusive canteen where the men could relax without leaving the compound. The production techniques evolved through trial and error, but the companies evolved very fast, developing mobile dummies that were so lightweight they could be mounted on jeeps, allowing a single vehicle to impersonate a tank while maintaining mobility. By early October, the workshops had produced 500 dummy tanks and 150 dummy artillery pieces. But the desert had one last test for the deceivers. On a night in the middle of the month, with the battle just days away, A savage sandstorm tore across the staging areas. In only a few hours, canvas ripped from frames, wooden structures splintered, and months of painstaking work were scattered across the desert floor. By dawn, hundreds of dummy vehicles lay broken like casualties of a battle that hadn't yet begun. Tony Ayrton surveyed the devastation as dust settled in the morning light. If German reconnaissance photographed this scene, he knew the entire deception would unravel, and the Second Battle of Alamein would be over before it began. Marshalling every available man he could, throughout that day and the following night, without rest, he orchestrated the resurrection of the Phantom Army. Quickly, frames were rewired, canvas restretched, and each dummy returned to its precise position to maintain coherence with previous reconnaissance photos. By the next sunrise, the illusion was whole again. In days, Montgomery would strike, and thanks to them, Rommel's forces would still be looking south. By October 18th, British fighters owned the skies over the Bertram area, creating an impenetrable shield against German reconnaissance. No enemy aircraft would photograph what was happening below until it was too late. In the south, where Montgomery wanted the Germans to focus, Operation Diamond, the construction of the dummy water pipeline extending into the southern desert, was going very slowly, all on purpose. Dummy pump houses sprouted along its length, complete with overhead tanks and straw figures dressed as engineers. At that rate, the pipeline wouldn't be ready for at least another week. For the Germans, this painted a clear picture. The British were preparing to attack from the south, just not yet. To take the deception to another whole level of complexity, on the nearby edge of the Munisib Depression, starting October 15th, Barkas's team constructed 3.5 dummy field regiments of artillery. But these were also deliberately sloppy. Netting that sagged more each day, paint that faded, positions that looked increasingly abandoned. The idea was to make the Germans feel smart, like they had discovered the deception attempts. Meanwhile, in the north, where the real attack would come, the final preparations were underway. For weeks, real trucks had been parked openly in the Martello assembly area. 2 nights before the offensive, real tanks moved north under the cover of darkness, took their positions, and disappeared beneath sun shields before dawn. That same night, dummy tanks filled the empty spaces in the rear, preserving the illusion that Montgomery's armor was still far from the front. And then came the final deceit, a double bluff. On the night of October 22nd, the sloppy fake guns at Munisib were replaced with real artillery. Crews moved in, shrouded by darkness, positioned their weapons, and held perfectly still the next day. From the air, these viciously accurate guns still looked like fakes. Everything was set for the third and final act of Operation Bertram. At 9:40 p.m. on October 23rd, the desert erupted. Over 800 British guns fired in unison, turning the ridge into a wall of muzzle flashes. The Second Battle of Alamein had begun. Behind the artillery, tank crews had spent the previous hours stripping away their sun shields and moving into attack positions. Shermans, Grants, and Crusaders lined the northern sector, engines growling in the darkness. As the barrage rolled forward, infantry units advanced in its wake, while engineers cut desperate paths through the minefields. The tanks would have to wait their turn. Even as the assault began, the deception continued. Operation Cannibal flooded the airwaves with false radio traffic, maintaining the illusion of activity in the south, while the real attack surged from the north. German signals intelligence heard phantom units that no longer existed, orders for movements that would never happen. After masquerading as a truck for weeks, the cannibals dropped their disguises and joined the barrage. Real shells screamed from positions the Germans had marked as dummies, smashing into Axis gun lines and blocking reinforcement routes. Then came the final shock at Munisib, where the obviously fake artillery positions that German intelligence had dismissed suddenly came alive, shocking the enemy. Montgomery's plan ran like clockwork. Every unit moved on schedule, and the British leader reveled in the possibility of shaking Rommel to his core. However, Rommel himself was absent, recalled to Germany for medical treatment days earlier. Command had fallen to General Georg Stumme, who suffered a fatal heart attack during the first day's bombardment. Because of this, for a few crucial hours, the German forces fought without clear leadership, each unit making its own decisions in the chaos. As the sun rose on October 24th, the Desert War had changed forever. Montgomery's headquarters hung with controlled intensity. Staff officers tracked every unit, managed every supply line, and coordinated every advance. For the first time since 1940, the Eighth Army wasn't reacting or retreating. It was dictating the terms. The Second Battle of Alamein ended on November 4th, 1942, and Rommel's forces, battered and outnumbered, finally began a withdrawal westward toward Libya. The Eighth Army followed, advancing nearly 60 miles in the first 3 days alone. By mid-November, the British had recaptured Sollum, Halfaya Pass, and entered Tobruk without a fight. Winston Churchill, speaking later in Parliament, put it this way, quote, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Operation Bertram made this victory possible. Thanks to Barkas, the camouflage unit at Helwan, and the pioneer companies, the army had been hidden in plain sight, moved into position, and unleashed while the enemy was still looking the other way. The evidence of Bertram's success came from the enemy itself. Among the captured was Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, commander of the Africa Corps, who took over after Rommel's departure, and who, during interrogation, confirmed that their intelligence had been completely fooled. They'd counted at least one Phantom armored division that never existed, and remained certain the main assault would come from the south. Even before his heart attack, Stumme reported to Berlin that the British offensive was still weeks away from being ready. On November 11th, 1942, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons to address Parliament about the victory. When he reached the subject of Operation Bertram, his words carried the weight of vindication, quote, "By a marvelous system of camouflage, complete tactical surprise was achieved in the desert. The 10th Corps, which he had seen from the air, exercising 50 miles in the rear, moved silently away in the night, but leaving an exact simulacrum of its tanks where it had been, and proceeded to its points of attack. Operation Bertram's success was a triumph of creative deception and an unprecedented application of cinematic techniques to the art of war. It wasn't just a matter of hiding tanks, it was the construction of an entirely believable lie. The scheme crafted a detailed and complex narrative for German intelligence to discover, complete with fake supply dumps, slow-moving dummy pipelines, and obviously fake artillery positions that lured the enemy into a false sense of security. By orchestrating a phantom army in the south and concealing the real one in the north, Barkas and his team didn't just fool the Germans, they dictated their entire worldview.